1288. It began in beauty and in blood. He saw her face in an improbable moment amid chaos and carnage, startling blue eyes and a soft mouth set in perfect, graceful lines. And then he saw the blood. Not a drop of it touched her. It was all around her, and all of her own doing. Ferocity and beauty. That's how it began. At first, he only saw men dropping on the road, an incomprehensible sight. 8 men, vicious criminals, who had lain in wait behind the trees and sprung themselves on the small party with whom she travelled. They had done everything as they always did, Baudry and his men. Their habit was to fall on the armed knights first, while the women and children screamed in terrified confusion. It was always over quickly. But this time, Baudry and his men only crumpled to the ground one after the other, though it was clearly not the armed knights who caused it. Griff looked up to the trees for archers, but there were none. This was not a rain of arrows. The horses reared and the women screamed, and the attackers merely fell down dead, as though from a plague. She was the plague. In the moment he realized it, she looked at him. Briefly, her eyes came to rest on Griff where he stood beside the road, and somehow she did not kill him too. He had raised his hands without thinking, arms extended and palms open, as though he could halt her with a gesture, or at least show he was unarmed. She saw it, just a blink down to his hands and back up to his face again, before she was turning away. It was fast. She was so fast in a way that made him think of a snake striking at its prey. Even before she had finished turning away from him, she drew a fresh blade from somewhere and threw it at Cuddy. Impossibly, it found the half-inch gap in his hard leather collar and sank into his throat. Fitting for Cuddy to die on his knees with naught but a look of surprise. Even more fitting that it was the hand of a woman that did it. All that violent lust was ended at last, with the almost leisurely flick of a woman's wrist, and her barely looking at him as she did it. Griff watched him die, trying and failing to relish it. It was all too sudden. 1 minute he had been bracing himself to watch as Baudry and his men slaughtered yet another group of innocent people, and the next minute, this. Cuddy was the last to fall. Now she stood with her back to Griff as she looked over the scene, and he did the same. Baudry and all his men were in the road, lifeless. Among the travellers, one of the knights was injured, and the other appeared dead. A woman clutched 2 children to her, while one of the unarmed men of the travelling party stumbled over bodies to reach her. The last was a monk with a bloodied eye and a stunned look. The beautiful woman took it all in at a glance and turned back to Griff. Now he saw she was a young maid. She wore no veil, and she was slim and straight, few womanly curves on her slight frame. There was no distress in her, no fear, no sign of what she'd just done. Months he'd spent with these murderous men, and he had learned something about this kind of unceremonious violence, and the kind of person capable of it. Her brows drew together, a look of concern or curiosity, or both, as she met his eyes again. It made her seem entirely human for the first time. He tried to tell her that he wasn't one of the thieves, but it came out as a weak and wordless croak. She was coming toward him with a purpose. He was strangely calm about it, though he didn't want to die. Not yet. Let him go home first, just once. He only wanted to see his home again in this life. If he died like this, he couldn't even be buried there. No one would know it was where he belonged. Even in death, he could not go home.